Horribly famous. Elizabeth I and her conquests. Elizabeth I is the most famous queen ever to rule England. Yet she almost didn't rule at all. A lot of people thought that her dad wasn't really married to her mum, so she shouldn't be queen. And this argument went on for the whole of Lizzie's life. Some people got so worked up about it that they plotted to kill her. And the people who weren't trying to get rid of her were trying to marry her off. In those days, it was thought women couldn't possibly rule without a husband to tell them what to do. But Lizzie kept everyone guessing about her love life. Although she had loads of suitors and romantic conquests, she rejected them all. Liz didn't want the expense or violence of war, but she had one conquest in mind all through her long reign. She knew that she needed the love and respect of her people to keep her crown, and she went out of her way to conquer the hearts of her subjects. She survived plots, smallpox, plague and war, and proved to be one of the cleverest rulers England has ever had. She was tough and sometimes unscrupulous, but above all, she was strong. And by the end of her reign, the country was stronger than it had been for centuries.
Chapter 1. Meet the Family.
Elizabeth Tudor was born on the 7th of September 1533. Her dad, Henry VIII, was not at all pleased that she was a girl. He already had a daughter, and like most people at the time, Henry didn't think women were clever enough to govern a country. 6 feet tall, red-haired, good-looking, Henry was famous for his love of wine, women, song, and dance. He liked his own way, and he could be very cruel about ditching people when they weren't useful to him anymore. Henry's first wife was Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who'd been married to Henry VIII for 20 years. But Catherine had only one living daughter, and Henry was getting restless. He needed a son. The only surviving child of Henry and Catherine of Aragon was Princess Mary, later Mary I. Like her mother and her father, up until that time, Mary was a Roman Catholic. Roman Catholics didn't believe in divorce, and Mary was a straight-laced sort of person who got grimmer as her life went on. Elizabeth's mum, Anne Boleyn, was nicknamed the Midnight Crow and the Witch by her enemies. She was said to be short, swarthy, with a long neck and a big mouth. She was also very pushy. She knew Henry was crazy about her, so she played hard to get. Henry wasn't used to this sort of treatment, and it made her seem all the more attractive to him. He decided he would marry her. The only trouble was he was already married, so he had to think of a way of getting rid of Catherine. Just a few months before Elizabeth was born, the palace made a shocking announcement. Henry's marriage to Catherine was not legal because she was his brother's widow. So Henry ditched his wife of 20 years and sacked the Pope as head of the Church. Instead, he made himself head of the Church in England. Lots of people thought the king was getting way above himself. Others, who didn't like the Church of Rome, thought it was a good thing. Henry didn't care either way. He had got what he wanted, a new, young queen who could produce a lot of sons. Unfortunately for Queen Anne, her first and last living baby was a girl. Lizzie was a beautiful baby with very fine, clear skin and reddish hair. She was looked after by her mistress of the household, a woman called Lady Bryan. She also had a governess, Cat Ashley, from an early age, as well as ladies-in-waiting. Chief lady-in-waiting was Big Sis Mary. In 1534, Henry got Parliament to pass a new Act of Succession. This said that only the children of Anne Boleyn were the legitimate heirs to the throne of England. and that he was the head of the church, so there. This made lots of people quite cross, but nobody messed with King Henry. Little Lizzie knew nothing about all this, of course. She was still in her nursery, being dressed in pretty clothes and having her big half-sister curtsy to her. But Elizabeth's life was about to change. She wasn't going to be a royal princess much longer. Queen Anne was a bit of a handful. She had a terrible temper and she liked to flirt. When she gave birth to a dead baby boy, Henry decided God was angry and was punishing him for leaving Catherine. He decided to get rid of Anne and start all over again. He accused Anne of having other boyfriends and said that this was treason, and the penalty for treason was death. After Anne was executed, everyone pretty much forgot about poor little motherless Lizzie. Henry was too busy to be worrying about either of his daughters. He was running a kingdom, not to mention wooing his next wife. He married again within a month of Anne Boleyn's death. This time, a nice, shy Protestant woman called Jane Seymour. Jane helped Henry to make up his quarrel with his older daughter Mary. She was also nice to Elizabeth, and finally she even managed to give Henry what he had wanted for so long.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, 16th of October, 1537. I have a new baby brother. His name is Edward. He was christened yesterday, and I carried his christening robe.
Catholic Mary was Edward's godmother, even if he was being baptised a Protestant. And the two half-sisters walked out of the chapel hand in hand. It seemed as though things had taken a turn for the better for both the princesses. But the era of happy families didn't last long. Little Edward had been delivered by caesarean section. In Tudor times, that wasn't good news. Operations were brutal, with no anaesthetic. Infection set in, and Jane died 12 days after Edward was born. Henry was heartbroken.
Chapter 2. Lizzie and Her Lessons.
Henry was looking for another wife. It wasn't so much that he liked being in love, it was more that he wanted another son. People didn't expect all their children to grow up in Tudor times, and for a king to have only one son was a bit of a worry. By this time, though, Henry was getting on a bit, and didn't want to go chasing all over Europe, so he tried choosing his next wife by mail order. He drew up a short list of likely princesses and sent off the court painter, Hans Holbein, to paint pictures of them.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, April 1540. Today, I met my new stepmother. Her name is Anne. She's a princess of Cleves. I like her very much, though she speaks very little English. She does not like to sing or dance, but she does beautiful embroidery, and she is going to teach me. She's a very quiet, serious lady, and seems a little afraid of my papa.
Anne of Cleves, a German princess, was not a success with Henry VIII, and it wasn't long before he ditched her and started looking for wife number 5.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, August 1540. Another new stepmother. This time it is a cousin of my mamma. Her name is Catherine Howard. Mistress Cat says it bodes well for me, for Queen Catherine reminds Papa of my mamma, and he loves her as he did mamma, and that will make him more fond of me.
Because the new young queen was related to Elizabeth, the little princess was given the place of honour at the royal wedding banquet. But no sooner had she made friends with this new stepmother than Catherine vanished off the scene. She was sent to the Tower when it was discovered she'd been seeing boyfriends behind Henry's back. 5 months later, Henry took his final wife. She was a widow who didn't want to marry him at all, but was afraid of what would happen if she refused.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, July 1543. Papa has married again. I'm getting a bit bored with him now. How many wives does he need? And how can they bear it? He is so fat and old and gross, and his ulcer stinks. Poor Catherine Parr. I wonder what will happen to her.
Catherine Parr turned out to be a good thing for Henry's children. Lizzie didn't go to school, but Catherine organised a whole lot of tutors for young Prince Edward. Whenever Elizabeth stayed with him, she shared his lessons. Later on, Lizzie had her own tutors, Roger Ascham, who was very strict, and Thomas Grindle, who was a lot jollier. Although it was all the rage at the time to be a bit of a swot, Lizzie was naturally a bright spark. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, said, "Her study of true religion and learning is most eager. Her mind has no womanly weakness. Her perseverance is equal to that of a man, and her memory long keeps what it quickly picks up. She talks French and Italian as well as she does English. When she writes Greek and Latin, nothing is more beautiful than her handwriting." After Henry married Catherine Parr, Lizzie's life was reasonably settled for a few years. Since Edward had been born, Dad had decreed that Elizabeth and Mary were both illegitimate, but at least he seemed to love them as much as brother Ed. Unfortunately, Henry's health wasn't good, and in 1547 he died, leaving 9-year-old Edward to be king. Because Ed was so young, the country would be ruled by his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. In his will, Henry had said that if Ed died without an heir, the throne should pass to Mary, and then to Elizabeth. Liz was staying at her house at Enfield when she was told the news of her father's death. She and Edward, who had been brought to the house to be told along with her, both burst into tears. Despite being terrified of him, they both seemed to have loved their father, and they were probably scared about what would happen next.
Chapter 3. After Henry.
One person who was secretly relieved that Henry had popped his clogs was his widow, Catherine Parr. The great love of Catherine's life was Thomas Seymour, brother of Lord Protector Somerset. Unfortunately, he would much rather have married Elizabeth, not because he was in love with her, but because he was in love with power. In particular, he wanted more power than his big brother. However, Tom Seymour knew that his brother wouldn't allow him to marry Elizabeth, so he married Catherine, and the couple took Lizzie to live with them at Chelsea Palace.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, October 1547. Life is a riot here with Aunt Kate, now that Papa is gone, and she no longer needs to watch her tongue. She is very funny, and Uncle Tom is a real laugh. He's always tickling me. Mistress Cat says he shouldn't, because people will get the wrong idea, but Uncle Tom just tickles me some more. Mistress Cat says that Uncle Tom behaves as he does because he is in love with me. She says that he wished to marry me, not Aunt Kate. I cannot think it is true. He's a full 20 years older than me. Oh, my cousin, Jane Grey, is to come and live with us, and we shall study together.
Lord Thomas Seymour was definitely up to no good. He was flirting with Lizzie because he wanted her to be on his side against his brother, and he was using Jane too. She was a niece of Henry VIII, and Lord Thomas was scheming to marry her off to King Edward. If Jane was one of his people, this would give him a lot of power, he thought. However, things didn't go quite as Tom Seymour planned. In March 1548, Catherine wrote to some friends, asking if Elizabeth could go and stay with them. She said that she was pregnant, and was therefore not very lively company for the young princess. The real reason for Elizabeth's sudden departure was that Catherine Parr had caught Lizzie snogging her husband and wanted her out of the way. 5 months later, Catherine died after giving birth, and Lord Tom was free again.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, October 1548. Mistress Cat keeps teasing me about Lord Tom. She says she can tell I love him, for I blush when his name is mentioned. She is right, though I would not admit it for anything. Dear Aunt Kate is not long dead, and I do not wish to cause pain or scandal. But, as Mistress Cat says, he is a handsome man, and will not be free long, so I should take my chance and wed him while I can. She asked if Parry should go and speak with Lord Tom about marrying me. I did not say yes, but nor did I say no. I hope they would take that as a yes.
Thomas Parry did go and talk to Lord Thomas Seymour. Seymour liked the idea. The young king wasn't looking too healthy, and if he died, Elizabeth, being Protestant like Edward, might become queen instead of her sister Mary. If he was married to Lizzie, Lord Tom would be king. He still had plans to marry Edward off to Lady Jane Grey, and wanted to keep in with the king. Seymour started sending Ed pocket money to keep him sweet, and he kept Jane Grey safely under his roof. He also asked different people who owned lands near his how many armed men they could muster. All in all, it looked very much as if Thomas Seymour was going to lead an armed rebellion against his brother. But it wasn't long before his brother figured out what Tom was up to and had him arrested. The big question was, did Elizabeth know what he was up to? Sir Thomas Parry and Cat Ashley were taken away for questioning. Finally, Parry admitted there had been talk of marrying Elizabeth to Thomas Seymour, but both he and Cat Ashley said Elizabeth had nothing to do with it. Lizzie herself refused to say anything to incriminate them. Plotting to marry a princess of England without getting permission from the Lord Protector first was treason. Thomas Seymour was for the chop. He went to the scaffold, still protesting his innocence, on the 20th of March, 1549. For the rest of her brother's reign, Liz kept her head down and stuck to her Greek and Latin studies. Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry were released and after a few months allowed to return to her service. And once the Seymour business had faded from people's memories, Lizzie was even allowed to visit her brother from time to time. But Edward was ill. He had tuberculosis, a lung disease that makes you waste away and cough up blood. As it became clear that Edward would not live long, the Protestants began to dread the day when Catholic Mary would come to the throne. Edward himself did not want Mary to succeed him, but instead of passing the crown to Elizabeth, he decided to go along with a plot by his chief minister, the Duke of Northumberland, and bypass both his sisters. Instead, his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who just happened to be married to the Duke of Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley, should be Queen of England when he died.
Secret Diary, July 1553. I don't believe it. Edward is dead, and Northumberland has set aside Papa's will and proclaimed Cousin Jane Queen of England instead of Mary. Mary is raising an army to fight for the crown. I don't blame her. The one good thing is that she can't possibly think that I'm mixed up in this one. I've been set aside too. On the other hand, you never know what people will say. I think I'd better stay in bed and pretend to be ill till I see how things turn out.
It didn't take long for Mary to see off Jane Grey. And when she had, Elizabeth was out of bed in a flash. She rushed to London to swear loyalty to her sister. She was much more popular than Mary, and people flocked to see her, but Lizzie knew that if she made one false move, she'd have had it.
Chapter 4. Sister Trouble.
When Mary came to the throne, she wanted to pretend that everything that had happened since her father divorced her mother hadn't really happened at all. She began by declaring Elizabeth illegitimate and saying she couldn't succeed to the throne. Mary also wanted to say sorry to the Pope and invite him to be head of the Christian Church in England once again. And she wanted to restore the old ways of worship before Henry had changed everything. Lots of people didn't want to go back to being Catholics, but Mary was determined. In fact, since she thought non-Catholics would go straight to hell when they died, Mary thought she was doing them a favour. Elizabeth decided to hedge her bets when it came to pleasing Mary. She blew hot and cold, sometimes begging Mary to send her teachers who would put her right on matters of religion, sometimes bunking off so that the Protestants could see she wasn't really serious. Mary knew that Elizabeth was just stringing her along. She knew Lizzie was more popular than she was, but short of executing her, and she couldn't do that without a very good excuse, the only surefire way of scuppering Elizabeth was for Mary to have children. The trouble was, Mary was getting on a bit, and she'd never really thought of herself as the marrying kind. But the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was her cousin and special friend, was offering his son, Philip, the King of Spain, as a husband. Philip was young and dead dishy. Suddenly, Mary discovered she was the marrying kind after all. But the idea of a Spanish husband did not go down well with the English people. Nobody liked the Spanish. It was only 6 months into her reign, but already Mary was unpopular. Lots of people wished that Elizabeth was their queen instead of Mary. With all this bad feeling around, some of the Protestant nobles decided this was a good time to make a bid for power. December 1553. Lady Elizabeth, I write to tell you that the news is good, with promises of arms and men from many of our supporters. We hope that you find acceptable our proposal that you marry Edward Courtenay, with a view to acting as joint sovereigns to this great realm of England. I am, madam, your most loyal servant, Thomas Wyatt. Sir Thomas Wyatt never received a reply from Liz, and later she denied she knew anything about his plot. But the chances are she was up to her neck in it. As it turned out, though, Edward Courtenay, the man they wanted Liz to marry, shopped the plotters. Wyatt decided to march on London anyway. He was arrested almost immediately, but he had plenty of supporters, and Mary couldn't arrest them all. However, all this support for Elizabeth just proved to Mary how dangerous she was. Mary summoned her sister to see her, but Lizzie had taken to her bed again, and she said she was too ill to move. Finally, Mary sent 2 doctors to see if Liz was putting it on. It was clear she wasn't. She was pale and weak, but, the doctors said, well enough to travel. They brought her to London in a litter. Elizabeth made them open the curtains when they reached London so that people could see her and feel sorry for her. She was brought to Whitehall Palace and kept a long way from everyone else. The Queen refused to have anything to do with her. Wyatt was condemned to death on the 15th of March and sent to the Tower of London to wait. 2 days later, an armed escort arrived at Elizabeth's rooms to take her down the Thames to the Tower as well.
Secret Diary, 17th of March, 1554. When I saw the Queen's warrant in their hands, I went cold with fear. I thought, my sister is too mean to build a new scaffold. She means to send me to my death on the block Jane Grey died on last week. I knew I had to delay, so I begged pen and paper and wrote pleading with her to believe that I had not known of Wyatt's plot. I know if I could see her, I would convince her I am a loyal sister. By the time it was finished, the tide had turned, so it was no longer safe to sail beneath London Bridge. So I have delayed my fate at least until tomorrow.
When Mary heard that Elizabeth had managed to miss the tide, she was furious with the escort for allowing her to write the letter. She sent a message telling them to get on with what they had been sent to do. So, despite her protests, Lizzie was escorted to the Tower. On the 11th of April, Wyatt was executed. However, Sir Nicholas Throckmorton was found innocent of being involved in the plot, and Mary knew that if the jury had acquitted Throckmorton, there was no chance of convicting Elizabeth. Not knowing quite what to do with her sister, Mary decided to send her away. She appointed a man named Sir Henry Bedingfield as her jailer, and ordered him to take her to his palace at Woodstock. Bedingfield was an honest man, but very strict with Liz. She was still under house arrest, and not allowed to write to the Queen, but at least she was alive and out of the dreaded Tower. 2 months later, Mary met her fiancé, Philip, and fell madly in love. The feeling wasn't mutual. Philip did his duty and married Mary, but he didn't fancy her. He wanted to meet Elizabeth, whom everyone said was much more fun. This wasn't just idle curiosity. Mary was an old woman by Tudor standards. If she did manage to get pregnant, she might well die in childbirth. Then Elizabeth would be queen, and Philip needed to keep her as Spain's ally. He finally persuaded Mary to let Lizzie come to the palace.
Secret Diary, 15th of April, 1555. Amazing news. My brother-in-law has come to see me. He is rather good-looking, blonde and bearded. We spoke for some time, I begging him to assure my sister that I had no part in the Wyatt rebellion, he telling me that she expects a child in the early summer next year. I think he must have seen surprise in my face, and I swear he raised an eyebrow as if to say that he too found the news unlikely. I think he was quite taken with me. He said that he would try to press my case with my sister.
Philip must have worked wonders, for Mary finally agreed to see Liz. Mary wanted her to admit her involvement in the plot, but Lizzie kept protesting her innocence. Neither would budge, and eventually Mary gave in, and Liz was no longer under house arrest. There was still no love lost between the sisters, though. Mary's baby was due in June. By August, when she still hadn't delivered, people were laughing at her behind her back. Now, it seems likely that she was never pregnant in the first place. Historians think she had a cyst or cancer which made her swell up. Lizzie was probably relieved. No baby meant she was still next in line to the throne. By this time, Philip couldn't stand his wife, so he left for the continent. He was gone for months, but he still continued to help Lizzie and protect her from her sister's anger. Philip's main concern was to stop England ganging up with France against Spain. At that time, the heir to the French throne was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, a cousin of Elizabeth and Mary. If anything happened to Liz, then Mary, Queen of Scots, would be next in line to the throne of England. So, if Philip wanted to be sure England kept out of French hands, he had to help keep Liz alive and cultivate her friendship with Spain for when she became queen. Liz guessed that part of Philip's plan was to marry her off to an ally of Spain. In 1556, she was summoned to court and ordered to marry the Duke of Savoy. When she said no, Mary said she would lock her up in the Tower again. Liz was so scared that she wrote to the French ambassador asking if she could come and live in France. He told her to sit tight, that if she wanted to inherit the English throne, she should stay exactly where she was. Time was on Lizzie's side. Mary was increasingly ill, and soon would be dying. She hated her half-sister more than ever by this time, and it looked as though Mary was going to override her father's will and name someone other than Lizzie as her successor. In fact, Mary still hoped she was pregnant. which would solve all the problems about who would succeed her. But nobody else thought that was likely, and support for Liz continued to grow. In November 1558, Liz got a letter from Mary.
November 1558. Dear Elizabeth, I fear that I do not have long to live. Despite your irregular birth, I am prepared to allow you to succeed to the throne of England on the following conditions. 1. That you retain the Roman Catholic faith in England and do not revert to Protestantism. 2. That you take over all my debts. Please let me know if you agree to these conditions. Mary.
Liz wrote back.
November 1558. Dear sister, I am sorry to hear that you find yourself close to death. I agree absolutely to the conditions you have laid down re my succession to the throne of England. Good luck for the future. Your loyal, loving sister, Elizabeth.
12 days later, Mary was dead. The Privy Councillors hot-footed it to Hatfield House to tell Liz the news. When she heard it, she fell on her knees and prayed. She was 25, and she was the Queen of England.
Chapter 5. Queen at Last.
Elizabeth knew she was in for a rough ride when she became queen. There were many people in and out of her kingdom who thought she had no right to the throne, and most of the people who supported her thought she was only a silly young woman and would be easily pushed around. But she was a shrewd judge of character. She had seen both her brother and sister make mistakes, and she'd had a long time to plan what she would do differently. By the time the Privy Councillors broke the news of Mary's death to her, the man she had made her Secretary of State was already at Hatfield and busy at his desk. He was Sir William Cecil, a Protestant. He didn't come from one of the powerful and dangerous noble families with a claim to the throne, but he was hard-working, careful, and loyal, and Liz trusted him. Now there was a Protestant queen. It was all change again at court. She threw out people like Sir Henry Bedingfield and all Mary's ladies-in-waiting, and installed Thomas Parry as treasurer, Cat Ashley as mistress of the Maids of Honour, and a young man named Robert Dudley as master of the horse. On the 15th of January, she was crowned. People crowded the streets to see their new queen. Most of them were glad that the days of Bloody Mary were over. The coronation was a huge success. She enjoyed being out and about among the people, and they adored her. Her next big date was the opening of Parliament. MPs had become quite keen to have a proper say in ruling the country, and Lizzie's first Parliament had some very definite ideas about a very important subject.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, 5th of February, 1559. Those MPs in the House of Commons are a complete outrage. They had the cheek to get together and present a speech telling me I ought to marry and breed. What makes them think they have the right? If God had meant them to rule the country, he would have made them king. But he didn't. He made me queen, ergo he thinks I know best. Which I do. So I told them where to get off. They can like it or lump it.
The men in the House of Commons were not too pleased, but they assumed that sooner or later the Queen would change her mind. Foreign suitors sent ambassadors flocking to court to woo her. Lizzie, however, was determined to live and rule and die a virgin. But then a spanner was thrown into the works.
Chapter 6. Lizzie in Love.
The spanner came in the form of Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's master of the horse. Rob was exactly the sort of sporty type Elizabeth liked, tall, handsome, witty, an expert horseman, and a keen jouster and dancer. Although he was married, it seems that Lizzie got caught out by her hormones. She fell in love. As the couple became closer and closer, tongues began to wag. People said that Lizzie sneaked into Rob's bedchamber at night, and there was even a rumour that she was pregnant with his baby. In fact, it doesn't seem likely that Liz was doing anything with Rob that would get her into trouble. She was surrounded by servants the whole time, and every one of them always swore that Liz was behaving herself. This didn't stop all the foreign suitors worrying. No king or prince wanted to marry a wanton woman in those days. It wasn't just the suitors who didn't like the Queen's love for Rob Dudley. The other courtiers hated him. The Queen's old nanny, Cat Ashley, didn't like Dudley, and neither did Lizzie's chief adviser, William Cecil. Cecil was away negotiating with the Scots as the romance got underway. When he came back, he found Dudley was acting as her chief adviser. Cecil was worried. It looked as though the Queen would marry her bonny, sweet Robin when his sick wife, Amy, died. Then Cecil would be out of a job. Things got worse when Amy Dudley died in suspicious circumstances. On the 8th of September 1560, she sent all her servants away to a local fair. When they returned, they found her body at the foot of the stairs. What happened to her? Why was she so keen for everyone to leave the house that afternoon? If she was dying anyway, why would someone want to murder her? At the time, a lot of people thought she had been killed by Robert Dudley. The coroner brought in a verdict of accidental death, but ever since then people have been putting forward theories. She may have committed suicide, depressed by all the rumours about her husband. She may have died of natural causes after an accidental fall. She might have been murdered by agents of William Cecil. She may even have been murdered by her husband, aided and abetted by the Queen herself. The fact is, we'll never know what really happened to Amy Dudley. But for the rest of Dudley's life there was a question mark over him which ruled him out as Elizabeth's husband. Despite this, he remained her master of horse, and they stayed close friends. Having realised that marriage was a no-win strategy, Elizabeth decided to make a big thing of staying single. She called herself the Virgin Queen and said she was wedded to the English people. They liked that. She made herself more popular on her royal progresses, her summer travels up and down the country. She mingled with the common people, and they loved her for it. She had, at least, won the hearts of her subjects.
Chapter 7. Pesky Cousin Mary.
Elizabeth was doing quite well during the first few years of her reign. She was managing to hold the middle ground between the Catholics and the extreme Protestants. She was making a big PR success out of being the Virgin Queen. Plus, she didn't have to worry about a half-sister of the opposite religion waiting in the wings for her to die. But she did have a pesky cousin, who would be a serious threat throughout her life, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart and Liz both had Henry VII for a granddad. By the age of 14, Mary was married to the French Dauphin or Crown Prince. And when Mary I died, Mary, Queen of Scots' father-in-law, the French king, saw his chance and stepped in to announce that Mary Stuart was the rightful Queen of England.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, January 1559. The cheek! Cousin Mary is calling herself Queen of Scotland and England. Cecil says she's only a kid, and it's just her father-in-law trying to wind me up. Well, he's succeeded. The last thing I need is some Catholic cousin bringing up Dad's dodgy divorce again. Before I know it, the Pope will excommunicate me, and every Catholic in the country will be plotting to put her on my throne. She has to be squashed, and quickly."
Fortunately for Liz, a fiery Scottish preacher called John Knox was leading a Protestant revolution in Scotland. Elizabeth couldn't stand John Knox, but she was delighted that so many Scottish nobles were anti-French and anti-Catholic. They wanted England to help them in their fight to get rid of the French. William Cecil was keen to invade Scotland and support the Scottish rebels, but Elizabeth was much too canny. She thought war was a waste of men and money. Besides, the Protestant lords weren't doing very well, and the Spanish might join in on the side of the French. So she sent Cecil up to Scotland to talk to the regent, Marie of Guise, who was desperate for some sort of settlement with the Scottish nobles. He came back with the Treaty of Edinburgh. This said, 1. Henceforth, in the interest of peace in Scotland, the government of Scotland shall be in the hands of a council of Scottish nobles. 2. All French troops are to be withdrawn from Scotland forthwith. 3. Mary Queen of Scots and her husband, King Francis II of France, agree that Elizabeth is the rightful Queen of England. The treaty was great news for Liz, and it brought peace to Scotland. But the problems were not over yet. In December 1560, the young French king died, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was a widow at 19. She sent a message to Elizabeth, asking if it was okay if she travelled home to Scotland via England. Liz saw her chance, and said that Mary could go home as long as she signed the Treaty of Edinburgh. Mary was fairly savvy herself, so she just sniffed at Lizzie's suggestion and went home to Scotland another way. Despite this, Mary wanted to be friends with Elizabeth. She knew Liz wanted her to sign the Treaty of Edinburgh, so she said she would if Liz recognised her as heir to the throne of England. Liz wasn't keen. She was scared that Mary would be a magnet for the Catholic rebels in her kingdom, and she was also jealous of Mary, who had knocked her off her perch as best catch in Europe.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, September 1564. I'm sick of hearing how beautiful she is. How graceful. How beautifully she dances. How agreeable. I shall have to watch out who she marries. Philip's out of the picture, thank goodness, since he married Elizabeth of France. But I don't want her married to any other powerful princes. One of my people. That's who she should marry. And I know the very man.
The very man was none other than her old flame, Rob Dudley. And he was horrified at the idea of being sent to Scotland. He needn't have worried, though. Mary didn't want a man with rumours of murder hanging over him. Besides, she had fallen in love. The man of her dreams was Henry Darnley. Darnley was an Englishman with a claim to the English throne, and he should have got Elizabeth's permission to marry Mary, because any children they had would have a strong claim to be Lizzie's successor. When Liz heard that Darnley and Mary had married without her permission, she was outraged. Lord Darnley was younger than Mary and very spoilt. He drank a lot, and he was always taking off with other women. He also got it into his head that she was two-timing him with her Italian secretary, David Rizzio. A bunch of nobles roped him into a plot to kill Rizzio.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, March 1566. Frightful news from Scotland. That young pup, Darnley, led a posse of so-called nobles up a back staircase at Holyrood and murdered Cousin Mary's secretary in front of the Queen. They held poor Mary at gunpoint, and she 7 months pregnant. It's a wonder she didn't lose the baby. I can't make head or tail of what happened next. It seems she and Darnley rode through the night to Dunbar Castle, which means she must be condoning the murder.
Not long afterwards, Mary gave birth to a son, James. She asked Liz to be godmother, and Liz graciously agreed, although she couldn't be bothered to go all the way to Scotland for the christening. 3 months later there was more dramatic news from Scotland. Darnley was dead. There'd been an explosion at the house where he was living. The main suspect was the rough, tough Earl of Bothwell, and Mary was letting him get away with it. 4 months later, the news came that Mary had married Bothwell. Liz knew what a terrible effect this would have on Mary's reputation, and she wrote to her to tell her.
No good friend you have in the world can like thereof, and if we should otherwise write or say, we should abuse you. For how can a worse choice be made for your honour than in such haste to marry such a subject who, besides other notorious lacks, public fame has charged with the murder of your husband?
Liz was right. Mary, top of the pops when she arrived in Scotland, was now bottom of the charts with her subjects. In the civil war that followed, Mary was defeated. Instead of going to France, where she had friends and family, Mary decided to go to England, where she knew no one. It was an incredibly stupid decision. The last thing Elizabeth needed was a Catholic cousin with a claim to the English throne gate-crashing her country. In fact, Liz was all for helping Mary at first. It was one of her most basic beliefs that kings and queens were sent by God to rule their subjects, and that subjects had no right to kick them out. Elizabeth's counsellors didn't agree, though. They said Mary was probably guilty of Darnley's murder, and that Liz should hand her cousin over to Mary's half-brother, Lord James Moray, who was ruling Scotland with a Protestant coalition. In the end, it was decided to hold an inquiry. The inquiry said Moray hadn't proved Mary was guilty of murder, but Mary hadn't proved she was innocent either. Mary was shut up in Tutbury Castle, a prisoner of the Queen of England. But Liz knew she was a dangerous prisoner. There was bound to be a rebellion to free her sometime or other. She was absolutely right. Quite soon there was a rebellion of the northern Catholic dukes and earls, who marched south planning to liberate Mary and make her Queen of England. It failed. About the same time, the Pope got all excited about the prospect of a Catholic queen and excommunicated Elizabeth. Parliament and Council were outraged, and from then on, Elizabeth was much harder on Catholics than she had been. Meanwhile, Mary continued to plot against Liz at every opportunity. Mary's great talent was making men fall in love with her. The Duke of Norfolk had fallen for her when he was chairing the inquiry. Elizabeth put him in the Tower because he was getting ideas about marrying her. When she let him out, he was plotting with an Italian banker called Ridolfi and the Spanish Duke of Alva within weeks. He was arrested again, and this time he was tried for treason and sentenced to death. At first, Liz refused to sign the warrant for his execution. She hated executing people, especially those she knew well.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, 31st of May, 1572. Cecil and Dudley are both on at me all the time to execute Mary. I know she is a danger to me, and I can never restore her to her kingdom, but I will not kill her. She is my cousin, but more important, she has powerful allies. I have, however, signed the warrant for Norfolk's execution. I must show people what happens to any who plot with her against me. But I hate doing it. He's such a nice young man.
The Duke of Norfolk was beheaded on the 2nd of June, 1572. Elizabeth had been on the throne for 14 years.
Chapter 8. Money and Men.
Although she made many conquests, Elizabeth never conquered other countries. She said,
It may be thought simplicity in me that all this time of my reign I have not sought to advance my territories and enlarge my dominions, for opportunity hath served me to do it. My mind was never to invade my neighbours or usurp over any. I am contented to rule over mine own, and to rule as a just prince."
This wasn't because she was very saintly. She simply couldn't afford it. Compared with the French and Spanish kings, Liz was hard up. War was the only thing she could ask Parliament to raise taxes for, but she knew her subjects didn't like taxes, so she did everything she could to avoid war. However, she didn't mind a bit of skirmishing with the enemy, provided she didn't know about it and it didn't cost her anything. And it so happened that there were a number of Jack-the-Lad sea captains around who enjoyed making fools of the Spanish. Liz got on well with these guys, who were mainly Protestant, loyal to her, and always up for an adventure. The most famous of them was Francis Drake. Drake captured a huge haul of gold and jewels that the Spanish had discovered in the New World, and brought it back to England. Liz was so chuffed with Drake that she went into business with him, and invested lots of money in his next expedition. When Drake arrived home, he brought with him £800,000 of stolen treasure. Naturally, Philip of Spain got more and more narked with Liz, and she realised it might be a good idea to get herself a powerful ally. A French prince would do. The Duke of Anjou, younger brother of the French king, had fallen in love with someone else, but there was a still younger brother.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, December 1571. Anjou is out of the picture, besotted with a Mademoiselle de Châteauneuf, if you please. But I'm told his younger brother, the Duke of Alençon, is on offer. Only 17, short and covered in pockmarks. Does not sound promising, though Smith says he is known to be vigorous and lusty. So he might get me with child, and that would put an end to the Scottish Queen and her claim to be heir to my throne.
Nothing happened for quite some time. Then, in 1578, Alençon sent his most smooth-talking courtier to suck up to Liz. Jean de Sumier was a real charmer, and he soon had the whole court talking about how cosy he was with Liz. William Cecil, who was now Lord Burleigh, was very keen on a French marriage, and an heir who would see off Mary, Queen of Scots. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, on the other hand, was very gloomy at the thought of the Queen marrying. However, Simier knew a thing or two about Leicester. He discovered that Leicester had secretly got married to Lady Lettice Knowles.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, July 1579. How dare Leicester get married? He knows that I don't care about any of these foreign suitors that I have to pretend to like to keep their governments on our side. I will put him in the Tower, and his beanpole wife. That will teach them.
Lizzie's counsellors pointed out that it wasn't against the law for an unmarried man to marry, so Leicester was saved from the Tower, although he was told to stay at home for a bit. Maybe Liz had thought that Leicester would always be there for her. Maybe she decided to make him jealous. She certainly decided to make a big play now for Alençon. The first step was to see him in person. Usually princes and dukes refused point-blank to come to England to be looked over like prize ponies, but Alençon wasn't fazed. He sailed up the Thames to Greenwich in August 1579. When Liz met him, she was surprised to find that he was quite a dish. Dark, swarthy, muscular, a witty courtier. What more could a girl want? She nicknamed him Frog, and made sure everybody heard her say how agreeable he was. For the next 12 days, Alençon stayed in England. He and Liz conducted a secret romance in snatched moments, as his visit was supposed to be a secret. Everyone was pretending he wasn't there, so Liz couldn't invite him to the court ball, so she arranged for him to watch it from behind a screen. Unfortunately, she was so keen to impress him that she spent the whole evening waving and smiling in his direction and leaping higher and higher in the air during the dancing. Fortunately for everyone, the visit didn't last long. Alençon was called back to France at the end of August. By the time he reached home, he had sent her 7 letters. In one he wrote, "If your Majesty will consent to marry me, you will restore a languishing life which has existed only for the service of the most perfect goddess of the heavens." Elizabeth liked her men to talk to her like this. She was quite taken with Alençon, and marriage negotiations got underway. However, Elizabeth's counsellors put their feet down about some of the terms proposed by the French. They weren't prepared to crown Alençon King of England immediately after the coronation, or to give him an income of £60,000 a year. As for Parliament, it just hated the idea of their English Queen marrying a Frenchman. The idea of marriage to a Catholic Frenchman was also very unpopular with many of Elizabeth's Protestant subjects, and her popularity took a dive at this point. It looked as if Lizzie's conquest of her people's hearts was well and truly over. She and Alençon saw each other on and off over the next few years. On one occasion they appeared together on a balcony, and Liz announced that she really was going to marry him. She kissed Alençon on the lips, took a ring from her finger and gave it to him. They were engaged. But then, the very next day, she called him to her privy chamber and said she couldn't marry him, at least not yet. Eventually she fell out of love, and by the end she wanted rid of him so badly that she paid him £10,000 to go away. Some people reported that the Queen did a little dance of triumph when she finally shipped Alençon off to Holland. Others said that she went on wearing his jewels and kissing the gloves he had given her. By this time, she had really perfected the art of keeping everyone guessing.
Chapter 9. Death Threats and Sea Battles.
Elizabeth was nearly 50 by the time it was all over with Alençon. There was now no question of her ever producing an heir to the throne of England. The person with the best claim to succeed her was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was still stuck in prison. Pope Pius V's excommunication of Elizabeth meant there were always some Englishmen who felt it was their duty to get rid of Liz from the throne of England and put Mary there instead.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, November 1583. All manner of incriminating evidence against Mary has been found at Francis Throckmorton's house. Half the Catholic gentry in the country are on his list to support a coup to overthrow me. But it is the Spanish who have been supporting the rebels, not the French. Throckmorton is to be tortured. Let's see if that makes him talk.
Throckmorton told Walsingham, head of Elizabeth's Secret Service, everything he wanted to know. This was how Liz learned that Philip II of Spain was planning a Catholic crusade to conquer England and put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne. Throckmorton was hanged at Tyburn, and the Spanish ambassador kicked out. But Elizabeth's Parliament and Council were seriously worried by the Throckmorton plot. They thought that Mary, Queen of Scots, should have been among those executed. But Liz wouldn't hear of it. Even though she was often angry with Mary, she said there was no real proof against her. Francis Walsingham decided to change all that. He set out to entrap Mary, and pretty soon he had proof that Mary was in league with all sorts of people. The expelled Spanish ambassador was one of them. The French ambassador was another. Even though Elizabeth told him she was on to him, the French ambassador was so cocky he took no notice. He was in league with various English Catholics, including an eager young man called Sir Anthony Babington. Babington was so confident that his plot to murder Liz and put Mary on the throne would succeed that he had his portrait painted with his fellow conspirators. This made life easy for Walsingham. Babington and his mates were put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the real problem for Elizabeth was what to do with Mary. Was there any legal way to get rid of her? In the end, it was decided to put Mary on trial. It was clear that she had been plotting against Elizabeth, and so Mary was tried by a court full of English peers and councillors, found guilty, and sentenced to death. If Liz had had trouble signing death warrants before, it was nothing to what she went through this time.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, December 1586. What am I to do? If I let her live, there will be more plots, and who knows but one of them may succeed. Yet I don't want to be the one responsible. She's a queen, sent by God to rule her country. It is not right for me to kill a fellow queen. And if I do kill her, France and Spain will have the excuse they're looking for to come down on me like a ton of bricks.
Her ministers were driven mad by her refusal to sign Mary's death warrant. In the end, one of her secretaries, Sir John Davison, slipped the warrant in among a lot of other papers she had to sign, so she could pretend she didn't notice what she was signing. As soon as she'd signed it, he hurried away and handed it to Lord Burleigh, who made sure the execution was carried out. Elizabeth had been absolutely right to worry about a Catholic invasion. Philip of Spain had been plotting to put Mary on the English throne for years. Now Mary had been executed, he had a cast-iron excuse to march in and depose Liz. He planned to send an armada, Spanish for large fleet, to put the English navy out of action, so that Spanish troops could cross from the Netherlands in other smaller ships and conquer England. Sir Francis Drake decided he wouldn't wait till the Spanish armada came to England. He sailed a small fleet right into Cadiz harbour and set fire to thousands of tons of Spanish shipping. Then he sailed round to Lisbon and defied the Spaniards to come out and fight. But the Spaniards were having none of it. Finally, Drake sailed to the Azores, where he captured a Spanish treasure ship. Drake's action set Philip's preparations back a year, but he was all the more determined to fight the English. Finally, Liz was convinced that there was no way to avoid this war, and the Armada was on its way. Drake was playing bowls at Plymouth Hoe when the Armada was sighted. On the 21st of July, he led his nippy English ships out of Plymouth harbour. The huge Spanish galleons tried to land on the Isle of Wight, but the English chased them out into the Channel. 6 days later, the Armada anchored off Calais. Drake sent fire ships into the anchorage, setting fire to many Spanish galleons. And on the 28th of July, a huge sea battle took place. The English drove the Spanish past the Netherlands, where they were hoping to land, and ship the Duke of Parma's troops over to England. Gales drove the Spanish ships north. Many of them were wrecked, hundreds of Spaniards drowned, and only half the Armada returned to Spain. Meanwhile, English troops had been gathering in case the Duke of Parma landed from the Netherlands. Liz decided that she would go and meet the men who were going to defend their country. She loved being out and about among her people, dressed to kill, and knowing exactly the right thing to say. Next day she made another conquest with a knockout speech which left everyone eating out of her hand.
I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And think it foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues.
Fortunately, rumours that the Spanish were coming were a false alarm. The Duke of Parma bottled out of invading England, and the threat of invasion was over. Preparations were made for a great victory celebration. But Liz had something else on her mind. Her beloved Rob Dudley, whom she had long since forgiven for marrying Lettice, was ill. He died on the 4th of September, and Elizabeth was devastated by the news. She had loved Leicester, even though she had never married him. Now she had lost her best friend.
Chapter 10. Good Queen Bess.
Elizabeth was more popular than ever after the Armada, and she had finally won the respect of her own councillors. It was a great time to be English. Everyone shared in the glory of the Queen. She was in great form, still dancing energetically every day, as well as riding, walking, and hunting. All the same, she wasn't getting any younger, and her problems didn't go away. Philip of Spain kept plotting with her other enemies right up until he died in 1598. She never had enough money, and people were always wanting her to get involved in foreign wars. On top of that, the 1590s were a sad time for her. All her old friends and councillors were getting older too. Walsingham died in 1590. Poor old William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, was getting on too. To cheer herself up, and maybe to make herself feel younger, she decided to make a new conquest. As usual, he was dead dishy, and his name was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. The trouble was, Essex didn't want to be by the Queen's side. She was just a boring old woman to him, so he ran off to join Sir Francis Drake, who was sailing to Portugal to support an anti-Spanish prince. Essex was in debt, and hoped to capture a Spanish galleon and come home with a lot of money. The expedition was a complete flop. They didn't capture any ships, thousands of men died of disease, and the Queen lost a lot of money. Liz was livid. However, on other adventures he was more successful, and he became something of a national hero, but he was on dangerous ground. Elizabeth liked to be the one who made the conquests. She didn't want any of her subjects to be more popular than she was.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, December 1598. Essex got up my nose yesterday, carping on about how hopeless everyone else is in Ireland. I told him that if he knew so much about it, he should have a go at running the show himself. He's not pleased. Still, serves him right.
England had ruled a bit of Ireland since the time of Henry II. It was when Elizabeth had started trying to impose anti-Catholic laws in Ireland, however, that the Irish Catholics rose up against her, led by the Earl of Tyrone. Essex was one of a long line of English commanders sent to sort out the Irish. He made as big a mess of it as everyone else. In fact, some people said he was in league with Tyrone. One day, Essex had had enough of being wet and cold with no money and thousands of rebels to deal with. He came back from Ireland, determined to speak to the Queen, but she was furious with him for leaving Ireland without her permission. Essex was arrested and kept in prison, and someone new was sent out to take over in Ireland. Later, when Essex was ill, Elizabeth forgave him and allowed him to return to his own home. Essex's house was in the Strand in London. Soon, anyone with a grudge against the Queen was popping in to see him, and Essex began to hatch a foolish scheme to capture her and rule in her place. Lizzie's spy system was as good as ever, though. She heard what was going on, and she sent her men to seize Essex. He was tried and executed on the 25th of February, 1601. Liz was starting to feel her age.
Elizabeth's Secret Diary, March 1601. I can hardly move this morning. People are muttering that I'm beginning to show my age. So I thought I would give them something to think about. Went for a 10-mile ride yesterday, and then went hunting. A lot of men, younger than me, were flagging by the end. Trouble is, I'm so stiff. I can hardly walk today. However, walk I shall. No one shall know that I am tired.
Not even Liz, with all her strength and spirit, could live forever. The fact is, she was nearly 70, in an age when the average life expectancy was 35. People knew that when she died, there was quite likely to be a struggle for the throne. Parliament was desperate for the Queen to name her successor, but she still refused. She was in good health right up to February 1603. In March, the court moved to Richmond. Liz was still depressed about Essex, and she became very ill, as her lady-in-waiting, Lady Scroop, told her brother.
16th of March, 1603. I write to you because I believe it may soon be time for you to make your long ride north, and so I warn you to get your horses ready. Our sovereign lady has throat ulcers and chest pains, which I think may be pneumonia. I think she is failing fast. Pray be ready on a fast horse beneath the window, and the moment she breathes her last, I will drop her sapphire ring down to you, that you may take it post-haste to the King of Scotland.
All Lizzie's leading counsellors and courtiers were agreed at this point that James was the rightful heir to the English throne, even though Elizabeth herself had never come out and said James was her successor. Now, as she lay dying on cushions in front of a fire, her counsellors tried for the last time to get an answer from her. Eventually, she said,
"Trouble me no more. Who else but my cousin Scotland?"
So at last it was definite. Lizzie's counsellors were ready. It was important that James received the news and came to London as quickly as possible to forestall a Catholic coup. In the early hours of the 23rd of March, 1603, Lady Scroop appeared at the Queen's bedroom window and silently dropped the sapphire ring from Lizzie's finger down to her brother. The Queen had drawn her last breath. Sir Robert covered the 400 miles to Edinburgh in 3 days. James the Sixth, King of Scots, was now James I of England. The Elizabethan age was over, and the Jacobean age was about to begin.